I was mulling over the situation with censorship. I've actually been mulling it over for a number of weeks. I talked about it with one of my Patreon discussions. We had a very interesting discussion about what it is and how it works. And anyway, I arrived at what for me, I think is a new thought. Maybe it's a revisit to an old thought, but it certainly felt new. And I thought it was important enough that it was worth sharing. And the thought has to do with what is going on relative to the things that everybody seems to know that are not spoken of, right? So, the lab leak is a great example of this because throughout the lab leak, there were large numbers of people who were aware that there was something very far off about the story, that this couldn't possibly have come from the lab. And, Jon Stewart did a hilarious job of satirizing that on Stephen Colbert's show recently. But the point is, many people said privately what they were not saying publicly. They self-censored. And we see the very same thing with respect to question of repurposed drugs at the moment and the question of harms from the current crop of COVID vaccines. There are lots of people discussing these things behind the scenes, and they're not of one mind. But there is a general sense that there is a public conversation, and that the very same people who restrain themselves in public when they are talking privately, when there's no microphone or camera or anybody taking down what they're saying, are a lot more broad-minded about these topics. And it raises a question. If so many people are aware of the deep story, what is the point of censoring it, right? And what I realized was that the point of censoring it may actually have to do with a particular trick of the mind that is known and has been known for quite some time, that is being used to game us. And so this brings us to the Asch experiment done by Solomon Asch in the late 60s. I should have looked at it.
I think 50s.
Well, we will find out in a second here. In any case, the experiment, Zach, do you want to put up the graphic I pointed you to?
Give me a second.
Well, I'm going to describe it while Zach is looking for it. In the Asch experiment, a group of individuals are seated at a table looking at a chalkboard.
51, early 50s.
51, it's earlier than I thought. Okay, so the group is composed of one test subject and a bunch of Confederates. But of course, the test subject believes he is one of a number of test subjects. And they are faced with simple, objective questions, the most famous of these being a series of lines of different length that are on the board. And the lengths are sufficiently different that the answers to the questions that they are asked are unambiguous. So there are lines of different lengths, and they are asked in sequence. Is line A longer, shorter, or the same as line B, for example? And when the sequence involves the Confederates of the experiment saying something that is clearly false, so that one after the other says the incorrect thing, the subject of the experiment is very likely to report that they see the same thing that has been said by the people who preceded them. So this is known as the Asch conformity phenomenon.
It's very unlikely. I didn't know you were going to walk through this. I have not reminded myself of the precise numbers, and it's actually in the book. But very few people conformed all the time to wrong answers, but a majority of people conformed sometimes to patently wrong answers on simple factual questions.
Right. And so the thought in the context of this modern, very bizarre spasm of censorship, where things that are perfectly obvious, like there's something conspicuous about a respiratory coronavirus, a novel respiratory coronavirus breaking out on the doorstep of one of the world's two premier laboratories studying and enhancing such viruses. It is what did he say? An explosion of chocolatey goodness
near Hershey,
Pennsylvania.
Yeah, no, that was the comedy routine to bring parsimony to the fore. Like, just think it through, guys. Like,
right.
how simple an explanation.
But the point is, lots of people had done the calculation ahead of time, and what they didn't do was say that they had their doubts. So here's the point. If you inflict stigma and other kinds of pain and cost on those who say certain things, people calculating their own well-being tend to stop saying them, even if they privately say, hey, I'm not buying this story. Publicly, what they appear to do is to fall in line with a narrative. And so when you have Christian Anderson and a large group of very degreed and otherwise trained virologists claiming that they have looked at the virus in question and that it is completely inconsistent with a laboratory origin. And then you have a vast chorus of people who have been trained in other things saying, yes, that's obviously, a valid scientific consensus. And those who step out of line are portrayed as absolutely crazy and known to be so, and all of that. What it does is it creates a pronounced bias in that which is discussed. And my point is, this looks very much like forcibly, through incentive, creating Confederates of the experiment who say the wrong thing. And it is said so regularly that most people will conform to it for the same reason that the subjects of the Asch experiment conform to it. And so the term for this, and I must say there's a part of me that wonders if it's not going to turn out that I have somehow borrowed this term from Eric, because very often he coins terms and occasionally they get borrowed by accident. But the term, I believe, should be astroturfing.
So You're going to have to define astroturfing.
Well, astroturfing is a false grassroots campaign. Like, imagine you were to hire an army of people to pretend to be irate about something and, protest it. So it looked like there was a large number of people demanding something that a large number of people were not, in fact, demanding. AstroTurf, reference to false grass that was invented for stadiums in which there wasn't enough sunlight because they were domes or whatever. I think they were invested. Yeah, because AstroTurf, the Astros, that's going to be the Astrodome. That's where it's going to come from. But in any case,
I would have guessed maybe the space program.
The space program, yes, the space station.
Not the. I would have guessed it might have come from the space program. That's all.
Yep. All right, I could see it. Mm-hmm. It's possible that the Astrodome comes from the kind of thinking that people involved in the space program would have deployed. I don't know, but in this case, I think it's beside the point. Really, all I'm getting at.
We're pretty good generalists, but when it comes to the particulars of the Astrodome, I think we're both way outside of our wheelhouse.
So far, yeah, we're so far outside the wheelhouse. We're not even on the boat anymore. We're adrift. But that's the wheelhouse. All right. In any case, astroturfing, I believe, is the use of punishment for those who speak an obvious truth that causes a false consensus to trigger most people to fall in line through the mechanism demonstrated by Solomon Asch. That's the point. And I think if we look at it that way, if you look out at the landscape of people on social media, especially people who have training enough that they could analyze some of these more difficult questions, and you find a bizarre lack of, discussion of something that you would imagine would be widely discussed. If doctors were seeing patients injured by vaccines, you would imagine that there would be a lot of discussion of that. And if you don't see that discussion, it does tend to cause you to imagine that actually this isn't being widely seen. What you don't intuit is that it may be that it's not being widely discussed in the place that you can see it.
Right. Right. And I do think this ties in nicely with the excerpt that I read from chapter 1 of A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century with regard to the need for generalists and the need in an ever more complex world for everyone to have some ability to switch domains, to do some domain switching and to perceive, not just so that they have facility in multiple kinds of thinking, multiple kinds of modes of knowledge that humans have, but also so that they can view their own, what they may still view as their home domain, with something like outsider status. And you can't ever totally get outside of what you fully know. And we've all experienced this. Teachers know this probably best. Parents know this, that, something that is fresh to you, brand new, that you see it with different eyes. And the more you know it, the longer you've done it, the harder it is to get into the headspace of someone whom is naive about it. And the more domains you know, the more you're sort of always a little a little uncertain, a little bit off balance, a little going, okay, yes, this is my place, this is my field, but no, I don't have as much total depth in terms of what everyone is saying across every little part of this domain, because I also have expertise over there and there and there and there. And so it affords you a kind of useful outsider status, which I think my prediction would be that this would be more likely to render you Ash negative.
I would agree. It does render you Ash negative. I think actually there were two connections in what you read that are important. I'll try to remember the second one, but the first one that you're pointing to, you have to realize that when an expert shows up on television or somewhere, that an expert on something related to COVID, they are definitely unlikely to be expert in the many domains that are covered by COVID, right? If they're an epidemiologist, they're not an evolutionist, they're not a chiropterologist, they're not a doctor.
That's a bad guy.
Right. So the point is, everybody is out of their depth in most of the realm. And as long as we understand that there isn't anybody who steps out of that, there's nobody who's had these particular set of disciplines as training. Therefore, we all have to realize, when people don't see us coming because our expertise is evolutionary. And the point is, actually, that does fit here because all of these things are evolved phenomena, whether it's, the immune system, whether we're talking about the viruses, whether we're talking about the population versus individual level phenomena.
And you listen to some of the virologists talk sometimes, and it becomes just crystal clear to an evolutionary biologist how little they understand about how evolution functions and what is actually going on at the evolutionary level. And yet many of them right now, these deep specialists, virologists and vaccinologists in particular, so it's sort of like virologists, vaccinologists, epidemiologists, public health experts being a sort of a looser affiliation, have all claimed to have the and only the relevant expertise in some of these COVID domains. And when I have heard really almost any of them try to say anything about the evolutionary implications of what's going on or how we might have gotten here, it is revealed very quickly that they don't know what they're talking about. We have made no claims to being vaccinologists or virologists or pharmaceutical experts or any of this, but what we have is a lifetime of evolutionary biology, which applies to all of this, and being generalists, like having knowledge, having dipped into varying degrees of depth, so many different domains, both within academia and outside of it, that it allows us an ability to see patterns where others might not. And what neither of us will hold any truck with is being told, no, you don't. You stay in your lane. This is ours to talk about. This is ours to talk about and decide. We're going to do it behind closed doors. And then after we do it, maybe we'll tell you what we decided, but we're certainly not going to tell you why we decided.
Yeah, this is a virology question and therefore not an evolutionary question. Doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah. It is inherently both. And there's nothing wrong with, virologists not being well-schooled in evolution as long as they know it.
And as long as they know why it would be relevant to have such expertise.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second way in which what you read is relevant to this has to do with the battle over whether or not the dictates that are handed down from on high are accurate enough that we should basically default to just applying them, right? And maybe looking askance at anybody who's breaking ranks, or if the people who are in charge don't know what the hell they're doing, or worse, are doing something that isn't motivated by an interest in public well-being, and we have to become conscious. And that's the question. So the model that you read about there, our model is that the mind defaults to this sort of conservative cultural mode, that is to say, the wisdom of the ancestors, as long as the ancestors' wisdom is applicable to the current moment. It's liable to be much better than trying to fumble your way through consciously in some new fashion. And when there's evidence that the ancestral wisdom is no longer applicable because you're in circumstances the ancestors didn't know anything about or for other reasons, then you have to go into conscious mode and figure, well, what are we going to do? And so in some sense, watching, Pierre Corey and the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance shut down as if other people know how to deal with COVID, when these are clinicians who have been treating COVID in the hospitals. Like, what the hell just happened, right? You don't know how to treat COVID. In fact, your treatment for COVID involves sending people home with Tylenol to sicken at home, right? So how do you shut down the people who have consciously figured out better ways?
In fact, the act of diagnosis of a medical problem or a societal problem, or the act of trying to figure out what might explain an observed pattern in science and trying to get all of the observed hypotheses on the table. This is an explicit act of consciousness. You cannot do this from your set and forget in the zone mode. You can do some of the later parts of clinical work, presumably, and hypothesis testing. If you're running gels, if you're doing some, same old sort of technique that you've done hundreds of times and you get better at the more you do it, that can be cultural. But the part where you figure out what might be true, that's inherently conscious.
It is inherently conscious. And so I guess to finish that, what we're being told, what Dr. Corey's being told over there, and what we're being told sort of writ large with regard to our media presence is you're not allowed to consider some of these hypotheses. And by doing so, you are being anti-scientific, which of course is exactly the opposite. And really, again, and I think it's sort of broken record time here, but the act of talking about all possible hypotheses is the scientific approach. And it is the way that we will solve problems and make progress. It is the only way. We might occasionally happen on to the right answer, having dismissed other possible alternatives without fully investigating them. Sometimes we'll get lucky. We cannot build a society based on expecting good luck. This makes no sense at all. Yeah, it makes no sense at all. And, the evidence is available that would tell you that the equivalent of the ancestors here, and I think, Tony Fauci stands in, and in fact, what he has been caught saying, that to disagree with him is to disagree with science, it sounds very much like a religious dogma, right? Mm-hmm. That he is the oracle who delivers the science. And this is very much not how it works. And all you have to do is go back to the lab leak and say, well, how did the oracle perform on that one?
Right.
And the point is the oracle and everything it was connected to, we now know from his emails, was lying. It knew way more than it was willing to share. And so the question is why...
The oracle was not merely wrong. The oracle was lying.
The oracle was lying, mm-hmm. And that oracle is now telling you equally dogmatic things. And you have a number of, Cassandra, whistleblower, canary in the coal mine types saying, hey, this is not what we are seeing, right? There is very clear evidence that there are other possibilities available to us. Why are we not talking about them? And so here's the question. Do you want to default to the oracle again and think, well, maybe the oracle is, slept it off and is now telling the truth? Or is maybe the oracle not the place to go? And we have to be in conscious mode, which I agree is scary. The fact that nobody knows what to do about COVID is scary. On the other hand, people are figuring it out.